Hello everyone, welcome to this Ignite presentation. My name is Katie Peters. For those of you that I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I'm a research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute. I'm going to talk to you about something that I've not yet heard talked about for the last 4 days. That concerns me a lot. I've not heard people actively talk about conflict, violence, or fragility. So this is my Ignite presentation. The reason that I wanted to do an Ignite was because I need you to know that most deaths from disasters occur in fragile and conflict-affected states. Most people that are vulnerable to disasters live with conflict. Conflict is a major driver of vulnerability to natural hazard-related disasters, and things are going to get worse as climate change exacerbates current trends. But despite the evident need, very little funding for disaster risk reduction goes to fragile and conflict-affected states. If we're really serious about achieving the Sendai framework or even the Sustainable Development Goals, we really need to think about putting our efforts towards those people that are most vulnerable. So I want to call on the Chair's summary for the Global Platform to actively and explicitly include the need to be more proactive on disaster risk reduction in places that are also affected by conflict. And let me explain why. So collectively, as a global community, we've articulated a set of Sustainable Development Goals, which we set out as a vision for achieving peace, sustainable development, and poverty reduction. The Sendai framework is a really important contribution towards those goals. But to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, we need to learn from the experience of the Millennium Development Goals. We also need to learn from the experience of the Hyogo framework. There's an increased emphasis on leaving no one behind. And for the DRR community, that means actively doing disaster risk reduction in fragile and conflict-affected states. What you may not know is that 58% of deaths from disasters occur in fragile states. Unfortunately, many of the major disasters over the last few years have been in locations that also experience significant challenges with violence, conflict, and fragility. Of course, conflict is a very complex term and it's very political, and it can range from everything to do with interpersonal violence through to community conflict, right the way through to a lack of upholding law. But in our research, we use a composite index, and regardless of the definition that you choose to use, what is very clear is that across the board, the people that are most vulnerable to natural disasters are also living with challenges associated with conflict. So we need to refocus our attention as a DRR community if we're serious about leaving no one behind. What's even more concerning is the fact that data collection on natural disasters is even more challenging in these complex contexts. So the figure of 58% is an underestimation. Now, this is not just a problem of the past or of the present. Climate science also points towards a growing concern that climate change is exacerbating vulnerabilities to disasters, and the at-risk populations as a result of climate change are also in those countries affected by conflict and fragility. Now, contexts affected by conflict are not necessarily the most exposed to climate change or to natural hazards, but they are the contexts where people are most vulnerable because they often lack effective, functioning, or equitable disaster risk governance systems. So to recap, so far, we've established that conflict-affected contexts suffer from the highest numbers of reported disaster deaths. We've established that major disasters over the last decade have been in locations affected by conflict and fragility, and they've been very costly in terms of finances for humanitarian response. And we've also established that the trend will get worse as climate change increases vulnerability to climate-related disasters. So we need to start looking much more critically at where we're spending our DRR finance. Despite the evident need, and despite all of the data and evidence, very little humanitarian or development funding for DRR goes to these contexts. Response is continually dominating the way that we spend DRR finance. What's interesting is that significant volumes of response money is spent in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. So it's not that there's no money, it's just too little, too late. For every $100 that's spent on responding to natural disasters in fragile states, only $1.30 is spent beforehand on ex-ante risk reduction. So why is this? Why do we continually come to these conferences and not hear people actively talking about conflict, violence, and fragility? So research at the Overseas Development Institute suggests a number of reasons for the reluctance on the part of international organizations, on the part of the UN, and on the part of donors for spending more actively before a disaster strikes. Now, I'm going to share with you 5 reasons that we've uncovered. The first is that there seems to be an underestimation of government capacity and willingness to act on DRR in countries that are often labelled as fragile or conflict affected. In the regional DRR platforms, and even in the regional ministerial platforms that preceded Sendai and that preceded this global platform, many countries, many UN member states were very willing to talk about the relationship between vulnerability to conflict and disasters. I sat in the African ministerial meeting in Mauritius, and I heard member states actively talking about disaster risk reduction and the links to conflict resolution and peace building. There is a willingness to talk. There is a willingness to actively think about the compound nature of risk. Another challenge we have is that there seems to be a lack of focused attention on vulnerability and risk in these contexts from a DRR perspective. So from a DRR perspective, we're not actively thinking about vulnerability and risk as it relates to conflict. If we're really genuinely serious about addressing the underlying drivers of vulnerability to natural hazards, we need to be talking about conflict. It is not optional. A third reason for the reluctance to talk about conflict is that there is a real separation of practitioners that work on natural hazards and those that work on trying to reduce conflict or sustain peace. We're operating in 2 completely different worlds. And that's prevented a comprehensive dialogue as a basis for understanding what a blending of DRR, conflict resolution, or peace building could look like. And it's also prevented a conversation around the benefits or possible limitations. The fourth, and this is a concern that I hear quite a lot from agencies that are working on DRR in conflict-affected contexts, and that there's a concern that you could unintentionally exacerbate the drivers of conflict. And this is being used as an excuse to not work on DRR in really challenging contexts. But again, this is just lazy. There are many, many tools and approaches we can use and apply to DRR to really think about the sensitivity of the context we're working in, even if that context is affected by violence and conflict. Things like the do no harm approach that's been used for decades, things like conflict-sensitive approaches. And finally, the 5th excuse I often hear is that there's a real concern about failure. There's a concern on the part of many donors and many implementing organizations that working in conflict-affected contexts is too challenging and they won't achieve positive progress on DRR. Now, I think we need to be a little bit more honest and open about what we can achieve in terms of reducing risk reduction. It's not always, even in the most peaceful of contexts, that we can achieve positive progress. So what we need is a more honest and accurate understanding of how we monitor and evaluate DRR in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. And we need to think much more about the flexibility that might be needed if we're working in contexts that are very volatile. So, here's the good news. There are some really interesting examples out there of agencies who do deliver disaster risk reduction in really challenging governance contexts. And they demonstrate that positive progress can be achieved. One of those organizations is Concern Worldwide. they've taken a really innovative approach to thinking about how you can do disaster risk reduction in some of the world's most challenging contexts. They don't focus their DRR solely on natural hazards. They think about the wider context, and they think very carefully about whether they're working in, on, or around conflict. Two recent examples that I've looked at concerns work in Somalia and also in crime-affected areas of Haiti. Now, in both cases, fragility was a real added challenge for the programming. But they used a very flexible approach, and there are already signs that communities can become more resilient as a result. Now, concerns experiences are not isolated. There are a number of practical agencies working on DRR in conflict-affected contexts. But the big challenge is that this is not recognized in regional and international forums. So we have no community of practice. We're not talking about what are the extra challenges as a result of fragility or violence. That community of practice doesn't exist at the moment, and it needs to if we're to leave no one behind. So the Overseas Development Institute and Concern Worldwide call on the UN and the delegates here today to include in the Chair's summary explicit recognition that proactive support for disaster risk reduction is urgently required in conflict-affected contexts. And that's needed if we're to achieve the global DRR goals and we're to leave no one behind. If anyone wants to know more, either about Concern's work or about any of the statistics that I presented here today, please feel free to come and find me. Thank you for your time.